Imagine a night so quiet, it feels like the world itself is holding its breath. The moon hangs low, casting long, cold shadows across the earth. There is a man, alone, weary, and broken, not just by the hardships of life, but by the weight of his own doubts, his own questions. Every decision he has made, every path he has taken, seems to have led him here, to a moment that feels unbearably still, yet impossibly charged. He knows, deep in his bones, that something monumental is about to happen, something that could either break him completely or change him forever. This man, whose name history will remember not as a king or a warrior, but as a struggler, a seeker, is wrestling. Not with another man, not with an enemy visible to the eyes, but with God himself. The thought alone sends a shiver down the spine. Wrestling with God is not something people boast about. It is a raw, intimate, terrifying encounter. And yet, here he is. His heart pounds like a drum in a silent room, echoing his own fear, his own desperate hope. He does not understand the ways of God, nor does he fully comprehend the divine plan. All he knows is that he cannot remain as he is, not broken, not resigned, not defeated. And the wrestling begins. It is more than physical. It is spiritual, emotional, and mental. Every fiber of his being is engaged. His muscles strain, his mind races, his soul aches. But what he wrestles for is not victory in the conventional sense. He wrestles for clarity, for identity, for blessing. He wrestles for a promise he cannot yet see. Every grapple, every struggle, every moment of doubt is a step toward revelation. And though the night is dark, he senses something even darker, the magnitude of what is at stake. If he loses this battle, what will he become? If he wins, what will be the cost? The silence around him is almost suffocating, yet within it, he hears the faintest whisper, an almost inaudible voice that seems to question, to challenge, to call him by name. Do you really want to see me? Do you truly desire my blessing? The questions strike deeper than any punch, any struggle he has ever endured. His heart pounds in response, not with fear, but with determination. Yes, he wants it. Whatever it takes, he will not let go. And in that moment, he realizes something profound. This is not about control. It is not about winning against God. It is about persistence, faith, and the courage to confront the divine, face to face, with honesty and raw truth. Many would call him foolish. Who dares wrestle with the Almighty? Who dares to challenge the infinite? But those who have witnessed such a struggle, those who have seen the fire in a man's eyes as he grapples with destiny itself, know that this encounter changes everything. It strips away pride, it burns away fear, it reveals the raw essence of a man. And this man, in his loneliness and pain, in his fear and hope, begins a battle that will echo through time. It is a night that will define him, a night that will transform him, a night that will leave him with a limp, but also with a blessing. This is the story of Jacob, the man who wrestled with God, who would not let go until he received his blessing. It is a story of struggle, of faith, of the relentless pursuit of what is promised, even when the path is painful, uncertain, and full of doubt. It is a story that speaks to every one of us, for we all wrestle with fear, with doubt, with God. And in his struggle, we find a reflection of our own. The question is not whether we will face God in our darkest nights, but whether we will hold on when the night seems endless, when the wrestling seems hopeless, when the blessing feels just out of reach. Will we let go, or will we wrestle until the morning breaks? Jacob had lived a life marked by tension, deception, and ambition. Even as a boy, he learned that the world rewarded cunning and cleverness. He stole his brother's birthright with a mix of courage and guile, deceived his father with a coat of many colors, and left home to escape the inevitable wrath of those he had wronged. Yet, as he fled into the night, his victories felt hollow, and the freedom he sought seemed always just out of reach. The wilderness was vast, quiet, and indifferent, a mirror to his restless heart. Each night, under the canopy of stars, he wrestled not only with the loneliness of exile, but with the gnawing questions that never let him rest. Who am I really? What is my purpose? And most piercing of all, what does God want from me? The journey was long, treacherous, and isolating. Days bled into nights filled with uncertainty. Jacob wandered through deserts and valleys, crossed rivers swollen with spring rains, and climbed hills where the wind seemed to whisper the truths he was too afraid to hear. Along the way, he encountered strangers, some kind, some cruel. Some offered a hand, some a dagger. But the lessons were the same. The world is unpredictable, faith is tested, and the human heart is fragile. Jacob's own heart bore the weight of ambition and guilt, hope and fear. He knew he had to reconcile these forces within himself before he could face what was coming. And then came the night before the fateful encounter. Jacob had stopped at a quiet stream, its water reflecting the pale light of the moon. He was weary, his body aching from the journey, his mind restless with thoughts of the family he had left behind and the uncertain future that lay ahead. It was here, in the stillness of the night, that he realized the truth he had been avoiding. He could not rely on his cunning or strength alone. He had reached the limits of human effort, and the path forward demanded something greater, something divine. But fear clutched his heart. To confront God, to wrestle with the eternal, was a thought both terrifying and exhilarating. Who could endure such a struggle? And yet, he knew he must. As the night deepened, a presence seemed to emerge from the shadows, heavy, almost tangible. Jacob could not see it clearly, yet he felt it all around him, pressing in, challenging him. His mind raced with doubt and hope, anger and desperation. What if this was not God? What if he was alone, grasping at shadows, wasting his strength? Yet something in his soul would not let him turn away. He gathered himself, steeling his resolve, and waited. Then, as if the heavens themselves had leaned closer, the presence moved toward him. The air shifted, the stars dimmed, and Jacob felt a weight upon him, not of flesh, but of eternity itself. The struggle began almost immediately. It was not gentle, not symbolic. It was raw, visceral, undeniable. Jacob grappled with a force he could not name, a being whose strength matched his desperation. Every sinew in his body strained. Every breath came in ragged bursts. Yet it was more than physical. Every moment brought with it a torrent of questions and emotions. Fear threatened to overwhelm him, but so did hope. Pain clawed at his limbs, but determination burned in his chest. He realized that to give in was not an option. To yield would mean losing everything he sought. Not just a blessing, but identity, purpose, and a sense of destiny. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity. Every movement was a battle, every pause, a test of endurance. Jacob's mind flashed back to the moments of his life where he had acted in deceit, where he had been selfish, where he had chased comfort over conviction. And yet, he clung to hope. Something inside him whispered, if you endure this, if you hold on, if you wrestle through the fear and the uncertainty, there is something waiting for you beyond the pain. A promise, a name, a transformation. And so he pressed on, gripping the invisible hand that challenged him, refusing to release it, refusing to surrender. By the first light of dawn, sweat-soaked and trembling, Jacob still held on. His muscles burned, his spirit wavered, yet a strange clarity began to seep in. The struggle was no longer about fear or desperation alone. It had become a communion, a conversation without words. In the fight, Jacob glimpsed truths he had never understood. The weight of responsibility, the depth of grace, the paradox of strength and surrender. He realized that wrestling with God was not an act of defiance, but of intimate pursuit, a willingness to confront the eternal with honesty, with courage, and with relentless desire for the blessing that lay just beyond reach. And still, the dawn crept over the horizon. Light touched his face, highlighting the contours of a man transformed, yet still struggling. For Jacob, this night would mark a threshold. He had entered the battle as a man burdened with guilt and uncertainty. He had wrestled with the divine, confronting fear, ambition, and his own restless heart. And though the outcome was not yet fully revealed, he sensed that something fundamental had shifted. The wrestling had begun a process that would shape his destiny, define his identity, and forge a connection with God that no man could sever. He had learned that to wrestle was not shameful, it was sacred. And in the quiet aftermath, he waited, knowing that the blessing would come, but only if he continued to hold on. As darkness stretched into the endless night, Jacob felt the first pangs of true fear. Not the kind of fear that comes from a shadow in the forest or the howl of a distant animal, but a fear that sank into the bones, a fear that gripped the soul. He realized he was no longer merely confronting a force of nature. He was facing the infinite. Every movement, every heartbeat, carried a weight beyond comprehension. The very air around him seemed charged, electric, and unyielding. It pressed against his skin and whispered in his ear, challenging the courage that had carried him through countless hardships before. But this was different. This was raw. This was God. Jacob's muscles screamed with strain. Each attempt to gain leverage was met with a counter he could not predict. The force before him was relentless, patient, and unlike anything he had ever known. And yet, for every ounce of strength he expended, there was a profound clarity creeping into his mind. He saw flashes of his life, moments of deceit, of ambition, of fear, and in these glimpses, he recognized the threads of his own imperfections. It was almost as if the struggle itself was a mirror, reflecting the man he had been, the man he had feared he would remain, and the man he could become. Pain and insight intertwined in a way that left him dizzy but unyielding. Hours passed like minutes, and minutes stretched into eternity. Jacob's thoughts became as much a battleground as his body. Doubt clawed at him, whispering that he was alone, that the blessings he sought were illusions, that his wrestling was futile. Who are you to demand a blessing? What makes you worthy? These questions pierced through his resolve, tempting him to release his grip and collapse into despair. Yet something deep within him refused. Every fiber of his being fought not just against the invisible force, but against the weakness in his own heart. He had come too far, endured too much, to surrender now. And so he held on, breath ragged, limbs trembling, but grip unbroken. The struggle was not silent. It resonated through every part of him, stirring emotions he had long buried. Rage, frustration, fear, hope, determination, they all collided in a maelstrom of intensity. Jacob remembered his past, the stolen birthright, the deception of his father, the fleeing from Esau's wrath. Shame and guilt pressed down like weights. Yet in the midst of these dark memories, a stubborn spark ignited. He would not be defined solely by his past. He would wrestle, fight, and endure until clarity, identity, and blessing were his. And in that resolve, he began to perceive something extraordinary, a sense of dialogue without words. It was as if the very essence of the force he grappled with responded to his persistence, recognizing the courage that refused to falter. At one point, Jacob felt himself lifted, thrown against the ground, pain radiating through every joint and tendon. Most men would have cried out, would have surrendered to the overwhelming power. But Jacob gritted his teeth and rose again, gripping the force that challenged him. There was no room for pride or arrogance, only raw perseverance. In that moment, a profound truth seeped into his consciousness. Wrestling with God was not about overpowering him. It was about persistence, honesty, and the relentless pursuit of divine purpose. The blessing was not a reward for strength alone, but a gift to those who refused to let go, who met God with both vulnerability and courage. Through the night, the struggle transformed. Pain and fear gave way, intermittently, to insight and revelation. Jacob began to understand the depths of his own heart. Every sin, every failure, every act of deceit or weakness was laid bare in the crucible of the encounter. And yet, paradoxically, he felt a strange liberation. For in facing the divine so fully, in exposing the raw, imperfect self, he began to touch the essence of grace. He realized that God was not distant or indifferent. He was present, engaged, and responsive to the courage of those who dare to approach him honestly. And so, Jacob's wrestling became more than a physical struggle. It became a spiritual awakening, an intimate confrontation with the eternal truth of who he was and who he might become. The night pressed on, the darkness unbroken except by fleeting glimpses of the stars. Time seemed irrelevant. Jacob's body ached beyond endurance, yet his spirit remained unbroken. Questions arose that had no answers. Why me? Why now? Why must this be the way? But each question was met with a profound sense of purpose. The struggle itself was shaping him, teaching him, preparing him for the life ahead. And though he could not yet see the blessing, he sensed its presence, shimmering like a distant light through the storm of exertion and fear. To let go would mean losing not only the blessing but the transformation that was quietly taking root in his soul. By the second watch of the night, Jacob's mind and body were exhausted, yet his heart was resolute. He understood that this was more than a trial of strength. It was a test of faith, endurance, and character. He clung to the unseen hand, not knowing if release would come in triumph or defeat, only trusting that persistence mattered more than the outcome at that moment. And then, in a flash of awareness, he sensed something profound. The struggle had become mutual. It was no longer merely about Jacob striving. The force he wrestled with responded, matched him in a way that suggested dialogue, recognition, and even respect. The night had shifted from combat to communion, from fear to revelation. As the first hints of dawn brushed the horizon, Jacob felt an unfamiliar sensation, a liminal space between pain and peace, struggle and understanding. He realized that the wrestling had peeled away layers of pretense, ambition, and fear, leaving only the raw essence of his being. In that moment, he was neither perfect nor complete, but he was seen, fully, by the eternal. And though the blessing had not yet been fully revealed, Jacob understood its inevitability. For persistence, honesty, and courage in the face of the divine could never be ignored. And so he held on, the night still dark around him, yet a quiet fire burning in his chest, a fire that promised that whatever came next, he would not be the same man who had started this struggle. He was being transformed. The night had reached its darkest depth. Jacob's body trembled with exhaustion, every muscle screaming, every joint throbbing with relentless strain. Sweat dripped into his eyes, stung, and blurred the shadows around him, yet he did not release his grip. Each second stretched into eternity, every breath a battle, every heartbeat a drumbeat of defiance. His mind teetered between lucidity and delirium, a war waging as fierce as the physical struggle before him. But the wrestling was no longer just about him. It was about the truth of his existence, the essence of faith, the boundary between fear and courage, between despair and hope. Pain had become a constant companion. His shoulders ached, his legs burned, and his fingers were raw from gripping an invisible hand that refused to yield. And yet, within that agony, Jacob felt a strange exhilaration, a knowledge that he was alive in a way he had never truly been. The struggle was shaping him, carving away the layers of deceit, fear, and hesitation that had defined his life. Every effort, every push, every pull, was teaching him a lesson that could not be learned in comfort or safety. He realized that God's ways were inscrutable, and yet, in the midst of this incomprehensible encounter, there was a clarity, a purpose, a whisper of promise. At one point, the force seemed to shift, countering Jacob's every move with uncanny precision. It was as though God himself was testing not only his strength, but his intent. Each grapple revealed a new truth. Persistence matters more than strategy. Faith outweighs cunning, and humility can coexist with courage. Jacob felt anger rise within him, not against God, but against himself, against the years of deceit, the choices that had brought him to this moment, and the weakness he still felt in his bones. But he channeled that anger into determination, refusing to release the grip that tethered him to destiny. Time blurred. He could no longer tell how many hours had passed. Sweat-soaked and trembling, Jacob's mind wandered to memories of home, to faces he had loved, to moments of fear and hope. He thought of Esau, the brother he had wronged, and wondered if reconciliation was possible. He thought of his parents, of blessings promised and promises broken. And through it all, he realized that this wrestling was bigger than him, bigger than any individual, bigger even than the life he had built through cunning and cleverness. This was about God's plan, about purpose, about the unseen hand that guided the cosmos. And Jacob had been summoned to wrestle with it, body and soul, without retreat. Pain and doubt collided. His knees buckled, his arms shook, and a wave of despair threatened to crush him. "Why me?" he whispered, though the words were swallowed by the night. "Why must this struggle be mine?" And in the silence, he heard the response, not in words, but in presence. The weight against him shifted, almost imperceptibly, a subtle acknowledgement that the battle was not endless, that perseverance was being observed. And Jacob understood, this was not about overpowering God. It was about holding on despite weakness, about seeking the blessing with a heart exposed and unafraid, about wrestling with honesty and courage even when the outcome seemed uncertain. Hours passed, and dawn began to hint at the horizon. Yet Jacob did not relent. He felt every fiber of his being stretched to the limit, his spirit tested beyond the ordinary. And in that crucible, something remarkable occurred. A twist, subtle but undeniable. The force he wrestled with faltered just slightly, not in strength, but in response. Jacob, sensing this, pressed harder, not out of ambition, but out of desperation for clarity, for identity, for blessing. He realized then that persistence could bend even the infinite, that courage could elicit recognition, and that the act of wrestling itself was sacred, transformative. Pain morphed into revelation. Jacob's mind opened in ways he had never known possible. He saw himself, fully, without pretense or shame. He recognized the deceit he had employed, the ambition that had driven him, the fear that had paralyzed him. And simultaneously, he perceived the grace that had always been present, subtle but unwavering, waiting for him to confront it honestly. Every struggle, every ache, every gasp for breath became a lesson. God does not reward perfection. He honors perseverance. He does not bless the comfortable. He blesses the resolute. And he does not reveal his purpose to the timid. He reveals it to those willing to wrestle through pain, doubt, and fear. The night was long, yet Jacob's spirit burned brighter than ever. Every sense heightened, every nerve alive. He continued to grapple with the invisible hand that both challenged and sustained him. At one point, the struggle became so intense that he could feel it in his very soul, a friction that transcended flesh and bone. It was as though the universe itself leaned in, observing this confrontation, waiting to see if a man could endure the full weight of divine interaction without faltering. And Jacob, battered, exhausted, but unbroken, met that weight with unwavering resolve. And then, the moment came. A pause, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. The presence before him seemed to shift, a silent acknowledgement that Jacob's courage, his persistence, and his honesty had been recognized. It was not a surrender, nor a capitulation. It was a dialogue, a communion beyond words. Jacob felt something deep within him stir, a new awareness of identity, of purpose, of blessing. His life up to that point, all the struggles, mistakes, and pain, had led to this juncture, and now he grasped the meaning of endurance, the depth of divine engagement, and the profound intimacy of wrestling with God. As the first light of morning brushed against the horizon, Jacob, still weary, still trembling, felt the night's struggle settle into a quiet, solemn peace. The battle had been relentless, yet it had revealed the depths of courage, the power of persistence, and the nature of blessing. Jacob understood that he had been transformed, not merely physically or mentally, but spiritually. He had faced the infinite, wrestled through fear, pain, and doubt, and emerged with a new understanding. Blessing comes not to the passive or the clever alone, but to those who dare to grapple with destiny, with God, and with themselves until clarity, purpose, and identity are revealed. And though the dawn painted the sky in soft golds and pale pinks, Jacob's wrestling was not yet over, not entirely. The struggle had reached its pivotal point, but the final resolution, the ultimate blessing, was yet to be received. What mattered now was the transformation within, the revelation that endurance and honesty in the face of God's mysterious ways had already begun to shape the man he would become. Jacob had entered the night as a man of ambition and doubt. He would emerge as a man of perseverance, courage, and faith. And this night, this wrestling, would echo through the generations, a testament to the sacred intimacy of confronting the divine without fear, without pretense, and without surrender. The darkness had become almost tangible, pressing in from all sides, and Jacob's body had reached the limits of endurance. Every joint ached, every tendon screamed, yet his grip did not falter. Sweat ran down his face, mingling with dirt and tears, but his eyes burned with a fierce determination that refused to be quenched. The struggle was no longer merely a contest of strength. It had transformed into a confrontation of wills, a battle of spirit against the eternal, a wrestling match that stretched beyond flesh and bone into the very essence of his being. Jacob felt every sinew of his body trembling, his muscles quivering under the strain, yet his mind and spirit were sharper than ever. He had realized, in the depths of that relentless night, that this wrestling was not about overpowering God, nor was it about achieving some selfish gain. It was about transformation, revelation, and the discovery of the man he was meant to become. Each grapple, each pull, each counter was a lesson. The force he wrestled with, the divine presence, was testing him not for punishment, but for insight, not for defeat, but for awakening. Hours stretched into what felt like lifetimes. Pain became a constant companion, gnawing at him, threatening to consume him, yet the fire of determination blazed brighter. Doubts whispered in the corners of his mind. You are alone. You cannot prevail. Let go and rest. But Jacob, sweat-soaked and trembling, knew that release would mean surrender, not to God, but to fear, weakness, and the unfinished purpose of his own life. He refused. Every ounce of energy, every fiber of his being, was committed to holding on. In that moment, he understood a profound truth. Persistence in the face of the eternal is itself a declaration of faith. The struggle began to take on a rhythm. Jacob's body, though exhausted, moved with a strange fluidity, anticipating the force that opposed him. Pain still struck like lightning, but he had learned to harness it, to translate it into resilience. His mind, once clouded with doubt and fear, had become focused, almost meditative, acutely aware of each moment, each sensation, each flicker of understanding that slipped through the night. He realized that this battle was more than physical. It was mental, spiritual, and emotional, a convergence of every part of his humanity confronted by the infinite. At one point, the presence shifted with startling force, throwing Jacob to the ground, his back slamming against the earth with a shock that reverberated through his entire body. For a heartbeat, he lay there, gasping, pain radiating like fire along every nerve. And then, in the quiet aftermath, he rose again, gripping the unseen hand with renewed vigor. It was in that instant that Jacob understood something transformative. The wrestling was mutual. The force he opposed was not indifferent. It responded, not merely to strength, but to endurance, to honesty, to the courage that refused to relinquish the struggle. In those hours, Jacob confronted the deepest parts of himself. He faced the weight of his past, deception, ambition, fear, and flight. Memories of the stolen birthright, the trickery of his father, and the rage of Esau pressed in on him, yet he held on. He realized that wrestling with God was also wrestling with himself, wrestling with every choice, every weakness, every moment he had sought to define his life by cunning rather than faith. Pain and insight intertwined, and in that crucible, he began to see himself clearly, not as the boy who had run from fear, but as the man who could endure beyond fear. As the night wore on, Jacob's struggle reached a crescendo. Every movement, every breath, every heartbeat was an all-out exertion of spirit and body. The divine presence pressed, countered, and challenged him with a force that was at once terrifying and illuminating. Pain, exhaustion, and doubt threatened to overwhelm him at every turn, yet a quiet voice within, born of instinct, courage, and hope, urged him onward. And in that relentless wrestling, Jacob discovered a paradoxical truth. Strength lies not in dominance, but in perseverance. Victory comes not to the clever, but to the steadfast, and blessing is not granted to the timid, but to those who dare to confront the eternal without fear. The hours blurred, and dawn began to edge across the horizon, spilling faint light across the world. Jacob's body was battered, his muscles trembling with every movement, yet his heart remained unbroken. And then came the moment that would define the night. The force before him faltered ever so slightly, a subtle shift that was almost imperceptible, yet impossible to ignore. Jacob sensed it instinctively, and in that instant, he understood that the struggle had reached a turning point. It was not about overpowering or defeating. It was about holding on, about wrestling with the fullness of his being until recognition, blessing, and transformation were achieved. With a surge of determination, Jacob pressed harder, every motion a declaration of endurance, every breath a testament to courage. And then, something miraculous occurred. Pain, exhaustion, and struggle coalesced into clarity. He felt the presence respond, not with force, but with acknowledgement. In that silent communion, Jacob realized he was being seen, fully and completely, not for his cleverness, not for his past, but for his willingness to endure, to wrestle, to confront the eternal with honesty and courage. The night's struggle had revealed him in his entirety, and in that revelation lay a profound truth. The blessing he sought was not merely a reward, but a transformation of the very soul. As the first rays of the sun stretched across the horizon, touching the earth with gold and pink, Jacob felt the night's intensity settle into a solemn quiet. He was exhausted beyond measure, every part of his body aching, yet he had emerged transformed. The wrestling had revealed the essence of perseverance, courage, and faith. Jacob had entered the night as a man burdened by ambition, fear, and guilt. He would emerge as a man forged by struggle, illuminated by insight, and prepared for the divine purpose that awaited him. And in that quiet dawn, Jacob understood something extraordinary. Wrestling with God is not about winning in the traditional sense. It is about showing up, refusing to let go, and allowing the encounter to transform you from the inside out. It is about facing the eternal with honesty, vulnerability, and courage. It is about embracing the pain, the doubt, and the fear, knowing that through them, a deeper understanding and a divine blessing can emerge. Jacob's struggle was far from over, but in that moment, he knew he had crossed a threshold. He had wrestled with the infinite, faced the weight of his own life, and glimpsed the blessing that awaited him. The night had tested him, refined him, and prepared him for the destiny that lay ahead. And as he stood in the first light of morning, battered, weary, yet unbroken, Jacob realized that he would never be the same man again. The wrestling had changed him forever. The first light of dawn crept across the horizon, spilling pale gold over the rough terrain. Yet Jacob remained on the ground, every muscle trembling from the relentless struggle of the night. He had been wrestling not merely with flesh and bone, but with the divine, with the unseen weight of eternity pressing against him, testing his courage, his persistence, his very soul. And in the aftermath of that long night, Jacob felt something new stirring inside, a quiet, powerful awareness that the blessing he had sought was not a distant reward, but a transformation that had already begun. For hours, he had clung to the presence, refusing to release it, refusing to yield to fear, doubt, or exhaustion. And now, in the soft light of morning, Jacob felt a strange calm settle over him. His limbs still ached, his back bore the imprint of the night's wrestling, yet his heart throbbed with a sense of clarity, identity, and purpose that had eluded him for years. The blessing, he realized, was not in victory over God, but in the courage to wrestle at all, to show up fully, honestly, and persistently, even when the outcome was uncertain. As he sat in the quiet, Jacob began to reflect on the night's struggle. Every pain, every doubt, every flash of fear had taught him something profound. He had confronted the truth of his own life, his ambitions, his mistakes, his guilt, and his courage, and found in that confrontation not condemnation, but insight. The wrestling had stripped away the layers of pretense and self-deception, leaving only the raw essence of who he truly was. And in that bare, vulnerable state, he felt the first stirrings of divine recognition, as if God himself was acknowledging the courage that refused to break. Jacob's mind wandered through memories of his past, his cleverness, his cunning, the stolen birthright, the deceit he had employed to survive and thrive. Shame pressed upon him like a heavy weight, yet he saw it in a new light. These were not merely sins or failures, but the raw material of growth, the soil from which understanding and humility could sprout. The struggle of the night had illuminated the consequences of his choices, but it had also revealed the possibility of redemption, transformation, and blessing. Jacob realized that every hardship, every error, every act of ambition had led him to this moment, preparing him to grasp a truth that few men ever encounter. As the sun rose higher, Jacob felt a shift within himself, a subtle but undeniable change. The fatigue and pain remained, yet a new strength coursed through him, a strength that was not physical, but spiritual. It was as if the wrestling had unlocked a deeper wellspring of resilience, courage, and faith within his soul. He understood that the blessing was not an object to be claimed, but a state of being to be realized, a profound awareness of identity, a recognition of divine purpose, and a courage to face the future unafraid. Jacob's perspective on his life, his choices, and his relationships had begun to transform. He could see his past not as a chain that bound him, but as a journey that had led him to this sacred encounter. And yet, the blessing carried a lesson that was not gentle. It demanded humility. Jacob realized that even in triumph, he remained dependent on the divine, that his strength alone could never have achieved this insight. Wrestling with God had shown him that courage, persistence, and honesty were necessary, but they were never sufficient on their own. The blessing was a gift, but it was also a responsibility, to live with integrity, to confront life with honesty, and to honor the divine purpose that had been revealed in the crucible of struggle. Jacob understood that this encounter would define him not for a single day, but for the entirety of his life. In the quiet moments of reflection, Jacob felt a strange, almost overwhelming gratitude. The pain, the exhaustion, the fear, all had been necessary. Without the struggle, there could be no understanding. Without the wrestling, no blessing. He realized that life itself was a series of such encounters, moments that test, refine, and reveal the true character of the soul. And in that insight, he found peace. Not the passive peace of complacency, but the active, fierce peace of one who has confronted fear, wrestled with uncertainty, and emerged with clarity and purpose. Jacob's thoughts turned to the future. He knew the challenges ahead would be many: reconciliation with Esau, the responsibilities of family and inheritance, the uncertainty of life's journey. But he also knew that he had been equipped in a way that few men ever are, with the courage to endure, the wisdom born of struggle, and a heart that had faced God and refused to release him until transformation was achieved. The blessing of that night would guide him, shaping every decision, every action, every relationship. He understood that the wrestling was not an end, but a beginning, a doorway into a life lived with purpose, resilience, and faith. And yet, the most profound aspect of the blessing was internal. Jacob no longer sought control over outcomes, nor did he crave the validation of others. The struggle had revealed a deeper truth. The essence of blessing lay in alignment with divine will, in the willingness to face the eternal with honesty, courage, and persistence. His perspective on life had shifted irrevocably. What had once seemed urgent and necessary now appeared transient. What had seemed trivial now held clarity and meaning. Jacob had glimpsed the eternal, and it had changed him from within. As the sun climbed higher, Jacob rose to his feet, still weary but unbroken. The marks of the wrestling, the limp, the bruises, the exhaustion, were visible, yet they were overshadowed by a new radiance in his eyes, a fire in his spirit that could not be dimmed. The blessing was not a tangible object, but a transformation, a new identity forged in struggle, tempered by perseverance, and recognized by the divine. Jacob knew that his life would never be the same. The night of wrestling had not only tested him, it had claimed him, reshaped him, and released him into a new way of being. In those early hours of morning, Jacob whispered a quiet prayer, not for relief, not for reward, but for guidance, courage, and continued strength. He understood that wrestling with God was not a single event, but a lifelong pursuit, a commitment to face every challenge with integrity, every fear with courage, and every uncertainty with faith. The blessing he had received was both gift and call, a recognition of past endurance and a summons to future fidelity. And as he took his first steps into the new day, Jacob carried within him the profound truth that had been earned through struggle. Persistence in the face of the divine yields not only blessing, but transformation of the heart, mind, and soul. The morning sun had fully risen, casting a gentle glow across the wilderness, yet Jacob remained still for a moment, letting the warmth seep into his bones. The wrestling of the night was over, but its impact lingered in every fiber of his being. He was no longer the man who had entered the darkness alone, trembling and uncertain. He was transformed, not merely by endurance, but by revelation, insight, and the intimate confrontation with the divine that had left an indelible mark on his soul. Jacob's body still ached. The limp in his leg, the bruises along his arms and shoulders, the rawness of his palms, each was a testament to the struggle. Yet as he stood, he realized that these marks were not signs of weakness, but badges of persistence. They told the story of a man who had refused to let go, who had wrestled through pain, doubt, and fear, and had emerged changed. And in that awareness, he felt a quiet confidence, a sense of identity that no hardship could shake. He began to reflect on the lessons of the night. Wrestling with God had shown him the depth of his own heart, revealing both its flaws and its potential. Ambition, cunning, fear, shame, they had all surfaced in the struggle. Yet so had courage, perseverance, and an unyielding desire for blessing and clarity. Jacob understood that these qualities were not in conflict, but complementary. The wrestling had taught him that embracing both vulnerability and strength, fear and courage, is the essence of faith. As he walked through the wilderness, Jacob's mind wandered to his future. Reconciliation with Esau loomed, responsibilities awaited, and the challenges of life beyond this night were vast. Yet he felt prepared in a way he had never known. The wrestling had forged within him resilience, patience, and a profound understanding of divine timing. He knew now that life's trials were not punishments, but opportunities, moments in which the soul is tested, refined, and prepared for purpose. The blessing of wrestling had already begun to guide him, shaping his decisions, his relationships, and his perspective on the world. Jacob paused beside a quiet stream, watching the water ripple in the early light. He thought of the nights when fear had driven him to flee, when ambition had led him to deception, and when doubt had clouded his heart. He realized that each of those moments had been part of the journey that led him here. Wrestling with God had not erased the past, it had reframed it. Every mistake, every moment of weakness, every act of cunning had been a thread woven into the tapestry of his destiny. And now, he could see the pattern, the purpose, the meaning, the divine design that had been shaping him all along. A sense of humility settled over him. Jacob knew that the blessing he had received was not his own doing. His strength, his persistence, his courage, they had been necessary, but insufficient alone. The divine presence he had wrestled with had acknowledged his resolve, yes, but the transformation itself was a gift. He understood that true blessing requires both human effort and divine grace, and that the two work together to create change that is lasting and profound. As the day unfolded, Jacob began to internalize the lessons in a way that would guide the rest of his life. He realized that the wrestling of the night had taught him not only about perseverance, but also about faith, integrity, and identity. He saw that life itself would be a series of such wrestlings, encounters with challenges, fears, and uncertainties that would test his resolve. Yet he now knew that persistence, honesty, and courage would carry him through, just as they had in the night's struggle. The blessing, he understood, was not a single event, but a lifelong journey of alignment with purpose and truth. Jacob paused to lift his gaze toward the horizon, the sun fully illuminating the world before him. He felt a new clarity about his path, a deep understanding that the wrestling had prepared him not only for survival, but for transformation. Every challenge he would face from this moment forward would be seen through the lens of endurance, faith, and insight gained in the crucible of the night. The blessing was no longer an abstract hope. It was a living reality within him, shaping his heart, mind, and soul. In quiet reflection, Jacob whispered a prayer, not for ease, not for comfort, but for guidance, strength, and continued courage. He understood that wrestling with God was not a singular event, but a principle for life. To meet every trial with honesty, to confront every fear with courage, and to persist in the pursuit of purpose even when outcomes were uncertain. The blessing of that night would remain with him, a source of inner strength and clarity that no hardship could diminish. And so Jacob began to walk forward, each step grounded in the lessons of the night. His body bore the marks of struggle, his mind carried the insights of revelation, and his heart was alive with courage and faith. The wrestling had ended, but its echoes would shape every moment of his life. He had discovered the profound truth that endurance in the face of the eternal yields not only blessing, but transformation of the soul, preparing him for a destiny that only the divine could fully know. The sun now hung high above the horizon, casting its golden light across the hills and valleys that had borne witness to the night of struggle. Jacob stood alone, his body battered, his muscles still trembling, yet his heart was light in a way he had never known. The darkness, the pain, the fear, all had passed, leaving behind a man who had confronted the infinite and emerged transformed. The blessing he had wrestled for was no longer distant or abstract. It was alive within him, a deep, resonant force that would guide him for the rest of his days. He thought back to the night, to the relentless struggle, to the moments when despair had threatened to overwhelm him. Every flash of fear, every pang of pain, every whisper of doubt had been a test, not of strength alone, but of character, faith, and endurance. And in that crucible, Jacob had discovered something extraordinary. That blessing comes not to those who seek control, nor to those who act with cunning alone, but to those who persist with courage, honesty, and openness to the divine. It was a gift of transformation, a recognition of the man he had become through struggle, not merely the man he had hoped to be. Jacob felt the shift deep within him. His mind, once clouded with doubt and fear, now gleamed with clarity. He understood his past with new perspective. The mistakes, the ambition, the moments of deceit, they were not stains to be erased, but stepping stones that had led him to this sacred encounter. Each error had shaped him, each act of perseverance had strengthened him, and each fear faced had revealed his capacity for courage. The wrestling had stripped him bare, yes, but it had also prepared him for the blessing he now held within. He looked toward the horizon and saw not just the physical landscape, but the map of his life spread before him. The paths he had chosen, the risks he had taken, the nights of flight and fear, they all converged in this moment of insight. Jacob realized that blessing was not a static reward, but a living principle, a call to continue walking faithfully, courageously, and with integrity. The wrestling had been the catalyst, but the journey of faith and transformation would continue for the rest of his life. In that quiet dawn, Jacob whispered a prayer, not one of requests or petitions, but of acknowledgement. "Thank you," he murmured, "for showing me who I am, for teaching me courage, and for granting me the blessing I could not claim by strength alone." There was a profound peace in his words, a sense of completion that did not erase the struggle, but gave it meaning. The night's wrestling had revealed the depth of his heart, the strength of his spirit, and the presence of the divine in ways that would guide him forever. As Jacob began to walk forward, his steps were lighter, yet each carried the weight of purpose and insight. He had been changed, not superficially, but at the core. He carried within him the awareness that life would continue to challenge him, that hardships would arise, and that fear and doubt would return. Yet he also carried something stronger, the certainty that persistence, courage, and honesty in the face of uncertainty, coupled with openness to God, could transform not only moments of struggle, but the man himself. The blessing was not merely a promise for tomorrow, it was a principle for every day that followed. Jacob had come into the wilderness as a man of ambition and cunning, haunted by fear and uncertainty. He emerged as a man of courage and insight, shaped by struggle, strengthened by endurance, and guided by the quiet, persistent presence of the divine. He understood now that life's greatest blessings often come through wrestling, not ease, through persistence, not passivity, and through honesty, not pretense. And in that realization, Jacob smiled, not out of triumph, but out of profound understanding. The wrestling had ended, but its echoes would guide him, shaping his actions, decisions, and relationships for years to come. He had seen the divine face to face in struggle, and in doing so, he had glimpsed the deepest truth of his own soul. He was blessed not because the struggle was easy, nor because the outcome was guaranteed, but because he had faced the eternal with courage, honesty, and perseverance, and had refused to let go until transformation was complete. As he walked on, the world seemed new, vibrant with possibility and purpose. Every hill, every valley, every shadow and light of the land spoke to him of endurance, courage, and divine intention. Jacob knew the journey ahead would hold new challenges, but he also knew that he carried within him the wisdom, resilience, and blessing born from wrestling with God. And so he moved forward, not as the man who had fled in fear, but as the man who had wrestled with the eternal, who had faced pain, doubt, and fear, and who had emerged transformed, whole, blessed, and ready for whatever destiny awaited. The wilderness behind him was silent, yet alive with the echoes of struggle and the promise of blessing. Jacob had wrestled, endured, and been transformed. And in that transformation lay the truest reward, a heart aligned with purpose, a spirit strengthened by courage, and a life illuminated by the enduring truth that persistence in the presence of God yields blessing, identity, and the profound knowledge of one's own soul. Jacob looked up, the sun now fully above the horizon, warming his face. He breathed deeply, feeling the strength of the blessing within him. The wrestling had ended, but its lesson would remain forever, to meet life with courage, to endure, to seek God with honesty, and to allow struggle to shape the heart. In that moment, Jacob knew he was ready, not just to live, but to live fully, blessed, and transformed by the night that had tested him beyond measure.